everyone who is just joining us now. We will begin in another 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, my name is Kate Marshall, and I'm the anthropology editor at University of California Press, and I am simply here to welcome you to the second annual New Books Café for the California series in public anthropology, hosted by Ieva Jusionyte and the Watson Institute at Brown. The Public Anthropology series is a series that was founded by Rob Borofsky and my colleague Naomi Schneider 20 years ago with the goal of identifying and elevating anthropologists committed to using the tools of the discipline to reframe public debate. The series is home to more than 50 titles, including Pathologies of Power, Democratic Insecurities, Laughter Out of Place, and The Land of Open Graves, among many other important books. In 2019, Ieva assumed leadership of the series and is partnering with me to carry it forward. For those of you who don't know her, Ieva is the Watson Family Associate Professor of International Security and Anthropology at Brown University, and she is the author of 2 books that I had the pleasure of publishing: The Savage Frontier, Making News and Security on the Argentine Border, and the award-winning Threshold, Emergency Responders on the US-Mexico Border, which was of course part of the series. I'll turn it over to Ieva to introduce our authors now.
Thank you, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. If you are joining us from the United States, good morning. For those of you watching the live stream in Australia, whether on Zoom or on our YouTube channel. And thank you to Ellen White from the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs for setting this event up online. It is my true pleasure to also welcome you to this now annual and second New Books in Public Anthropology Virtual Café, an event which we will be hosting each year to mark the publication of scholarship that addresses issues of broad societal interest and urgency. Today, we will hear from the authors of 3 books that were published by the California Series in Public Anthropology in 2021. Each author will have about 10 minutes to read from the books or talk about the books. And after the presentations, we will have a short discussion about what it means to do public anthropology and to write about social issues they are studying in a way that allows them to stay true to the spirit of public scholarship. Okay, so here is the lineup of our speakers today. First, Mara Buchbinder is a professor and vice chair of the Department of Social Medicine and adjunct associate professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the author of Scripting Death, Stories of Assisted Dying in America. Our next author is Andrea Flores, who is a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor of education at Brown University, my colleague here. She has served in advisory capacities for college access and college retention programs in Nashville, Tennessee, where she has conducted research since 2010. Andrea is the author of The Succeeders, How Immigrant Youth Are Transforming What It Means to Belong in America, which came out just last month and is the newest release in the series. And our third speaker you will hear from today is Aaron Jackson. He is currently a lecturer in anthropology at Victoria University in Australia, and he's joining us from Melbourne. where it is already 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Aaron is the author of Worlds of Care, the emotional lives of fathers caring for children with disabilities. You can purchase all of these books today, and there is a promo code that I will right now copy in the chat. So if you go directly to the publisher's website, you can order your copies of these fabulous books. Okay, so now without further ado, I cede the floor to the authors, starting with Mara.
Thank you so much, Ieva, and thanks to you and Kate both for all of your editorial support with the publishing of these books and also for organizing this event. It's a really fun opportunity. So my book is about the aftermath of the legalization of medical aid in dying in Vermont. And medical aid in dying is also known as assisted suicide, and it permits physicians to write a lethal dose of a prescription to a terminally ill patient for the purpose of ending the patient's life. So Vermont passed its Patient Choice and Control at End of Life Act in 2013. It was the fourth state in the US to legalize the practice, and there are now up to 11. So this is an issue that has really captivated the public's attention over the past couple of decades, but there have been sort of critical gaps between the advocacy narrative surrounding this movement and how medical aid in dying is actually experienced on the ground. And so one of my primary goals in writing this book has been to foreground some of these lesser known narratives. So I've selected two excerpts from the book to share with you today. The first is a portion of my introduction in which I address death through the lens of storytelling. And then I'm going to share a very brief excerpt from a story about one of these deaths. Okay. So this section is called The Power of Story. During the course of my research, I heard hundreds of stories about death, sudden, unexpected deaths and long, protracted ones, heartbreaking, traumatic deaths and more anticipated, ordinary ones, deaths at home and deaths in hospital, deaths of close kin and deaths of beloved pets. Many people told me stories of surreptitious assisted deaths undertaken before medical aid in dying was legal. One state legislator recounted how a young aunt had died of cancer in the 1970s. The aunt had been hospitalized for months when one day she begged her sister, the legislator's mother, to help me get this finished because she could no longer stand seeing her husband's distraught face when he came to visit her. The legislator's mother spoke with the nurse and they took care of it. An aid in dying activist told me how her father, a famous physician, had been able to hasten death while he was dying from cancer because he had pharmacists and physicians in his circle. While fear and shame permeated the illegal act, it was also beautiful, with families surrounding her father, playing his favorite music and reading his favorite poetry as he died. Several people told me how the death of a well-known state politician who shot himself in the head after a terminal cancer diagnosis catalyzed the movement for aid in dying in Vermont. And an eloquent right-to-life activist told me many stories of beautiful natural deaths she had witnessed, challenging my preconceived assumptions about the nature of dying and suffering. Stories can heal. Their power to do so is what drew me to study medical anthropology 20 years ago. Yet stories can do even more. They can move us in different ways, stir our emotions, direct our attention, mobilize resources, and even provoke social and political change. No story was a more powerful catalyst for the assisted death movement than that of Brittany Menard. Menard was diagnosed with glioblastoma, an aggressive and fatal brain cancer, at the age of 29, while she and her new husband were trying to start a family. Menard left California and spent the last 10 months of her life in Oregon, where she could take advantage of the state's death with dignity law and end her life on her own terms. She also devoted herself to advocating for aid in dying. On November 1st, 2014, Menard ingested a lethal dose of medication while at home, surrounded by her husband, Dan Diaz, who would later quit his job to work full-time for Compassion and Choices as an aid in dying advocate, and her mother, Deborah Ziegler, who would share her daughter's story when she testified before the California State Legislature in support of its End-of-Life Options Act. Brittany Menard's story quickly captured national media attention, including a People magazine cover. Because of her youth and vitality, she was an unlikely spokesperson for dying with dignity, but she changed the face of the movement. Within 2 years of her death, California legalized aid in dying, and 5 years later, the number of permissive jurisdictions in the United States has more than doubled. Brittany Menard unmistakably demonstrates the power of a single story. Yet the singularity of her experience also leaves certain questions unanswered. How did her family absorb the social and economic costs of relocating to Oregon and establishing residency, which enabled her to access death with dignity? How was she able to establish care in a new medical system and identify a physician willing to prescribe the lethal medication when she was already so sick? How did her undeniable privilege as an upper middle class, beautiful white woman contribute to her experience of achieving this type of death? And how realistic would this option be for others? What is eclipsed by framing aid in dying advocacy through the power of a single narrative? Brittany Menard's case suggests that stories operate like theater spotlights. They direct our attention to the protagonist while obscuring parts of the broader backdrop. In this book, I highlight many stories, but I also situate them within their broader cultural, political, and socioeconomic contexts to show the larger patterns that individual stories cannot. In doing so, I aim to illuminate the gaps between dominant advocacy narratives and what assisted death looks like once it is put into practice. Acknowledging the power of story also requires me to address the thorny question of who has the power to speak for the dead. Some people I approached for my research were reluctant to give an account of a particular person's death because they did not feel authorized to be a spokesperson for the deceased. As an ethnographer and author, I recognize that I too have wrested an uncomfortable power in representing the deaths of people I have never met. Several people I interviewed told me they had been unhappy with journalists' accounts of their loved ones' deaths, putting additional pressure on me to both defend my ethnographic approach and do justice to their stories. Kelly Ray Knight has compared anthropologists to vultures because they collect the wreckage of people's lives and traumas for intellectual consumption. Robert Desjardins has similarly asked, how does a person relate the stories of other people's deaths without making a stylistic show of it, without words dancing on the remnants of their lives? On one level, these descriptions resonate with me. There is something discomforting about using stories of one person's tragedy for professional gain. At the same time, telling stories that would not otherwise be told can change the way public debates are framed. The tension between these positions, exploitation and memorialization, is one that many ethnographers face. Ultimately, I accept responsibility for telling these stories because I think they ought to be told. A key premise of this book is that the dominant media and advocacy narratives surrounding medical aid in dying in the United States provide only a partial picture of what this practice might mean for agency and control at the end of life. And then the next excerpt is about the death of a man that I call Tom Jarvis, and his friend Neil was present with him at his death. Tom chose the day of his death according to the weather forecast. It was winter in Vermont, and he did not want to inconvenience his friends who would come to pay their respects after his death. When Neil arrived at Tom's apartment at the appointed time, he was struck by Tom's calm, almost serene presence. Neil himself had been unable to sleep the night before. He told Tom, "For me, it was like the last night of a closing show that had been on Broadway for years and years successfully. But it's the last show and all the cast members are nervous because of the tension of the last show." Tom liked Neil's analogy and told Neil that for him, going to sleep had been like a dress rehearsal. Tom shared some meaningful stories, how he wanted to be remembered. Together, they emptied 100 capsules, twisting the two halves apart and dumping the powder out, which Neil described as laborious, though somewhat comedic work. For many, this task represented a final opportunity to display care for a loved one and took on sacred ritualistic properties. When the moment arrived, Neil said to Tom, "I'm not going to let you drink alone." Though Neil was not a drinker, he poured himself a glass of whiskey. They shared some final words, clinked glasses, and drank. Neil described this moment as follows, and I'm quoting him extensively here. "How to describe the tension in the room? The atmosphere in the room was surreal. I'm sort of in a state of shock watching him, wondering, how's this going to play out? You know, is he going to slump over? Is he going to throw up? What happens when he dies? They didn't really tell us that. They said correctly, well, drink it all up because he'll fall asleep quickly, then slide into a coma, and then his heart will stop within 2 minutes. So that's what happened. He's sitting up like you're sitting up. I put a pillow behind his head. He put his head back, closed his eyes, sitting like you are, legs crossed. He had his arm on the arm of the couch, sitting there relaxed. And sure enough, breathing slowed down and it stopped within 2 minutes. And I'm studying him, I'm watching him kind of disbelieving that we did this. And I got up and I know I'm in a state of kind of euphoric shock. Euphoric because he did it and he did it smoothly, and shock at what we did. Relief and numbness and everything else swirling around me. And there's nobody there with me. After 20 minutes, Neil called the hospice nurse as she had advised him to do. Together, they shared a moment of comic relief, finding amusement in the fact that Tom had died sitting up with his legs crossed and his arm stretched out across the back of the sofa. Neil found this incongruous pose a fitting end to his friend's life. It wasn't a religious ceremony. It wasn't chanting. It wasn't angel singing. It was his dying process was part of his life, he said. And I'll close there.
Thank you, Mara. Andrea?
Hi, thank you all for coming, and echoing Mara. Thank you, Ieva, Kate, for organizing this and for shepherding this book into creation. And so, as Ieva mentioned, I'm the author of The Succeeders, How Immigrant Youth Are Transforming What It Means to Belong in America. And I conducted this research with Latinx immigrant and immigrant origin youth who participated in a college access program in Nashville, Tennessee. And the research that I was doing is these young people were finishing high school and figuring out what comes next for them. Is it college? Is it entry into the workforce? What's next? And I was interested in how these young people were thinking about their educations and the value that they may have ascribed to them. And not just what they thought, but what it meant to their families, their friends, and their community. And what I found was that youth were hoping to leverage academic success towards the social acceptance of them and their loved ones as valuable members of the nation. And so with that, I will read from the introduction. Miss Millerton's classroom stank. It was the usual mix: Axe body spray, fresh Doritos, caustic hand sanitizer, and vanilla-scented perfume. 5 college admissions officers and a handful of Latino college students stood at the head of the classroom, forming a zigzagged line in front of a graying whiteboard. They had come to talk about their universities to a packed house of Latino high school students. The high schoolers were part of Succeeders, a nonprofit college access program for Latino youth in Nashville, Tennessee. The students in the program, whom I call the Succeeders, were mostly from low-income Mexican and Central American families. A majority of the students were undocumented immigrants. Another sizable chunk came from mixed status families whose members had a combination of undocumented, documented, and citizen status. The Succeeders were also poised to become the first in their families to graduate from high school and potentially attend college. Their educational aspirations were rooted in hopeful American dreams and harsh xenophobic realities. One by one, the collegians, mostly Succeeders alumni, introduced themselves and described their sometimes circuitous paths to college. As the Succeeders and I politely suppressed late afternoon yawns, Mateo began to speak. His forceful words, delivered slowly at a volume that demanded each of us lean forward to hear him, electrified the sleepy room. At college, I learned a lot about myself. They developed me to be a better person. If you have the will, the determination, that fire inside you to be something more, make your parents proud. College is hard, but it's going to make you a better person. He then pointed to the standard issue US flag drooping in the corner of the public school classroom. Quoting Mateo, "You see that flag right there? It stands for freedom. There's no reason you can't be successful here in the greatest country in the world. It is our responsibility as Hispanic Americans." Following Mateo's rousing address, known troublemaker Lalo sat down with Liz, the Succeeders program coordinator. Lalo's sole contribution that afternoon had been confidently answering one admission officer's question, "What's our mascot?" with "un güero," a blonde or white person. His heckle was an amusingly accurate description of the school's marketing materials that caused me to guffaw inappropriately. As students shuffled out of the classroom, I overheard what Lalo tentatively whispered to Liz. He quietly vowed to graduate, to stop misbehaving, and to make his father proud. In just 5 words, words that I heard countless times throughout my fieldwork, he expressed the same sentiments and understandings of his education's purpose that Mateo had. I want to be somebody. Lalo's terse statement of ambition to be somebody and Mateo's call to success on behalf of kin and country reveal that educational achievement had far deeper meanings for these youth than just getting a diploma. Only through educational success, Lalo believed, could he be somebody, a valuable person worthy of the respect of others. Only through educational success could Mateo fulfill his responsibility as a Hispanic American. Only through educational success could they both make their parents proud. Over the course of my fieldwork, I would come to understand the ultimate stakes of academic achievement for the succeeders and their families, belonging in the United States of America. Succeeders underscored to me that earning academic credentials could disprove the national and local stereotypes of Latino youth as underachievers and their families as interlopers into the nation. Yet as Mateo, Lalo, and others strove in school, they also became sharply critical of their own striving and the somebodies they aspired to be. The individualistic model of success and racist moralized terms of membership that pushed succeeders to see themselves and those they loved as nobodies misaligned with their lives' reality. It was collective caring that sustained these youth and motivated what they understood to be the communal ends of schooling. The people that succeeders loved, undocumented friends and family, at-risk peers, and others stigmatized by racism and nativism, were and are left out of common notions of success, Americanness, and valued personhood. But they were not left out by succeeders. These youth's refusal to leave their loved ones behind in the pursuit of success opposed the petty inclusion offered by a hostile nativist state that breaks families apart through deportation, retracts social welfare from the most vulnerable, and limits inclusion to the best and brightest. The succeeders' ultimate refusal to discard loved ones is a way for us all to rethink belonging as necessarily rooted in caring connection to others. Those connections are forged by the care we share with each other as people who are always and already somebody. And now, jumping to the end of the book, lots of exciting stuff happens in between, but I want to return back to that notion of somebodyness. I put the paper in the wrong place. In the wake of an even harsher political and cultural context, the succeeders continue on. They have graduation parties and weddings. They celebrate being employee of the month at the used car dealership. They send their own children to better schools with hopes and dreams they dared not wish for themselves. They protest. They don't protest. Whether or not they are going to school or struggling to get by, each succeeder is building their own kind of success through the unfolding project of their young lives and those lives' connections to others. While I have them, I do not offer any specific policy prescriptions here, not for immigration reform, not for education. Policy is one way politics are done, but is not the only way. All of our actions are critical in creating the world we want to see. We do not need to wait for our politicians and policymakers to catch up with us. As the succeeders demonstrate, we have the power to change our world by changing each other's lives. A kinder and united society is ultimately what stands to be lost if US inclusion in policy and practice is not predicated on caring relatedness with others. These are the hard-won lessons that the succeeders have learned and now have taught. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Aaron?
I'll echo the others. Firstly, I really want to thank Ieva and Kate and everybody else at UC Press for being so supportive and making my first time publishing so enjoyable. I'm delighted that my book is part of the series And I really mean it when I say that it's a real privilege for me to be in such great company today with you all. So thanks for inviting me. I've selected a couple of sections to read from Worlds of Care. I'll just provide some context first. The book tells a story about parents, particularly fathers, and how they go about making sense of their lives in the context of intensive caregiving. Okay, so specifically caring for children with severe cognitive and developmental disabilities. And there's a strong autoethnographic component to the work as a caregiver myself. So the first section I've chosen to read speaks to this living life with a difference. I've just arrived at Paul's house. He's one of a number of caregivers that I got to know during my field research in the States. I've introduced myself to his daughter, Pearl, who is 22. She's nonverbal and has a rare genetic disorder associated with profound multiple disabilities. And so I'm lying awake in bed that night in a spare room in their house, and I'm listening to Pearl fuss and Paul attend to her. This is from the introduction. So instead of going back to sleep, I sat in Paul's kitchen in the dark and gazed out the window at the dark foliage fringing the back of the house. Forlorn trees with heavy somber branches swayed gracefully in the wind, ghostly figures in the light of the half moon. Disability has become a fact of life and routine for Paul. But far from being something he takes for granted, the everyday seems like something of an achievement, unfolding against a background of uncertainty and in relation to demands that clash with the imperatives of control and autonomy. Sitting there in the pre-dawn silence, I recalled a story he told me not too long ago. It was about his visit with the school district superintendent right after the discovery that Pearl had been sexually assaulted. That had been 6 years ago. Paul had found evidence clearly suggesting that she'd been sexually abused sometime during school hours. A criminal investigation was launched, but it failed to find the person responsible. The incident powered a profound despair that still gripped him and posed a direct threat to his trust in others. In trying to win the sympathy of those in attendance at the school meeting to discuss the incident and evoke thoughtful consideration of his situation with Pearl, I believe Paul was trying to convey something about the uncertainties of their everyday life together and its precarious achievement. That is to say, while their life is beset by health crises and frightening seizures, they find some measure of control and security over the impersonal forces that lie beyond us through successful interactions of trust with others, an ongoing achievement that violence and prejudice can destroy at any moment. He was sitting in the school district superintendent's office, along with the assistant superintendent for student services, the director of special education, and Pearl's mother. Despite the magnitude of the situation, there was a calm dignity softening the edges of his anger and despair. He looked the superintendent straight in the eye and said, "Listen, I bet you and I start every day the same. Every morning I wake up, wiggle my toes, stretch, and get out of bed, okay?" The superintendent nodded in agreement. "Then I put on a robe and slippers," Paul said, more nodding. "Every morning for 20 years, I walk down the hall and into my daughter's room to check that she's still alive and hasn't died in the middle of the night." Silence. So two of the most important things to come out of my research were the forms of communication and intimacy that parents establish with their children in the absence of language through the body's capacity for emotional attunement. That's such an important aspect of caregiving, and it really helps parents respond in sophisticated ways to their children's needs. The other thing was through the acquisition of caring skills and knowledge, fathers' attention and responses are refigured in ways that open up possibilities for them to rethink what it means to be a man, what it means to be a father, what it means to live a good life. And, this often involved pushing back against prevailing gender stereotypes of masculinity that perpetuate social inequalities, discarding those values and norms that are no longer livable under these circumstances of intensive caregiving. And so in finding themselves attuned to the everyday in new ways, they often embark upon public forms of personal care. That's a term I borrowed from Ieva Jusionyte, but these public forms of personal care are designed to carve out spaces of belonging for their children. Sometimes this is carried out at the level of law and policy, but sometimes these forms of care are just stitched in to the thick of everyday life. And so this is the focus of the next section that I've chosen to read. So for Paul, the scene that I opened with, it's connected to a variety of much smaller moments that he says have threatened Pearl with erasure. And so he says, Paul loves swimming, Pearl loves swimming. That's something we know she really loves. There was a school swimming day and the regular PT, that's the physical therapist, was absent. They, the teachers, found out a little late. And so they still changed Pearl into her bathing suit and had her sit by the pool, not go in. And at the end of the hour, changed her back into her clothes and put her back in the classroom. I said, okay, and did someone explain to Pearl why she had to watch everyone else do exactly what she loves and wasn't allowed? Did anyone ever think that maybe that wouldn't be so nice to her? Could you have called me so I could have come down to the pool and gone in with her myself? Could you have kept her in the classroom? Could you have done anything else? Did anyone look at it from her point of view? No. Empathy, thinking of things from other people's points of view. It's a big deal. My mind wanders. I recall an event a couple of years ago when Dakota was 2. I took him with me to the post office in town. As we waited in a long, crowded line, he clamped his hands down over his ears and broke into a lengthy soprano scream. A woman glanced back at us, twisted her face in disgust, clicked her tongue, and then clamped her hands over her own ears. My face flushed red, exuding heat. I felt strangled. My limbs felt heavy. I was angry and embarrassed. One awkward moment seemed to pile on top of the other until she was finally served and made her undignified exit. I was reeling with confusion over her reaction. I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know how to respond. Like many of Paul's experiences, my own with the woman at the post office provides a window into ableist attitudes and behaviours that serve to enforce norms of public behaviour and create and maintain the spatial boundaries of the able-bodied community. Sadly, when we fail to grasp the intentions of another or become empathetically unavailable, as this woman clearly was, the mutual recognition necessary for the confirmation of moral worth is lost. The widespread pressures for one's child to conform to seemingly obvious social rules and norms can induce a binding self-consciousness, especially when one continually anticipates disapproval, fully aware that one's child will fail against these standards. For example, a child may have a meltdown in a supermarket and elicit judgmental stares from strangers for being disruptive, or parents may witness strangers openly staring or turning away in disgust at their child's behaviour in a restaurant because they're making strange noises or eating with their mouth open. This can strike open a chasm between self and others that cannot be easily bridged. For many parents, this may effectively ensure they avoid public spaces with their children. I began to wonder more and more about how parents bypass or overcome these situations on their way to finding some kind of normal. I didn't bother sharing my story with Paul. I'm not sure why, nor did I tell him that the woman's actions had the desired effect of making me feel uncomfortable and incredibly anxious about running errands with Dakota in the future. The more I thought about this moment and others just like it, the more I wished I had Paul's ability to immediately respond to the demands of these interpersonal situations and do what works in Dakota's best interest. It wasn't only his ability to arrive at the best strategy required to intervene at the level of law and policy that I envied. It was his spontaneity in ethical action, that is, his ability to act intuitively without detaching himself from the concrete situation. Things do not go well at the DME, that's the durable medical equipment supplier where he takes Pearl's wheelchair to be fixed. When we pick up Pearl's wheelchair from the supplier, Paul notices that the laterals have been repositioned incorrectly. Earlier that morning, Paul was emphatic that he didn't want them messing around with the laterals because Pearl's physical therapist had carefully set and positioned them while looking at x-rays showing Pearl's scoliosis. He even took pictures beforehand of their placement as a safeguard. The technician denied touching them, and a flush of anger had turned him scarlet at Paul's insistence that he was in the wrong. I can't believe they messed up, Paul says, as we drive back to Brookline with Pearl's broken chair in the back. There's a long silence. We merge onto the empty freeway. It's late and the sun is starting to lose some of its force. If this was some other piece of equipment, would you care as much? I ask, finally breaking the silence. No, how dare you do this to Pearl? I mean, this is what they do to all of us parents. This is all she has. This is her only anything. She could love that chair more than she loves me, okay? You don't do this. You don't do this to her. Why do you think they're so unhelpful? Well, that's a good question, he says. I guess because no one holds them accountable. I don't know, I don't understand it. Now we get into empathy. Some people have very low empathy. That's how you find people who matter in the world. I'm very convinced of that in my life. The difference between schmucks and everybody else is empathy. They can't empathize with Pearl, okay? You give them a kid in a chair and say, go live for a week, then they'll learn a lot. They just don't empathize. They don't understand, you know, what's the big deal? They don't understand that life is tough enough. Why are you adding to it? And again, would a car dealership give you a brand new car with scratches on it? And would you take it? No, but I'm supposed to take a $7,000 wheelchair with scratches on it. It just boggles my mind. It's just so infuriating, and it's just that much worse because it's Pearl. Later that night, Paul sends me a copy of his email to the director of branch services and the rehab technology specialist. He opens the email by identifying the problem with the laterals and the obstinacy of the technicians. Then he writes, so in brief, the laterals need to be fixed, the seat cover needs to be replaced, the abductor wedge needs to be replaced, and Pearl deserves an apology. Social change was the hope of some of the fathers I spent time with. I started to see these moments of shame and social discomfort as windows into the springs and motives that propel parents in their individual and collective attempts to challenge and transform spaces of social activity and belonging. Many of the fathers remarked on how they tried to trouble or alter the perceptions, experiences, and thinking of others. For example, Earl told me that when he notices people doggedly staring at Zachary, whether with seeming curiosity or disapproval, he candidly comments on Zachary's nonverbal behavior and what it means. He hopes that by overtly addressing the looks, he can deepen the way people experience Zachary and themselves. People often respond favorably, he said, dropping their guard and entering into a conversation with them. I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone, for sharing these parts of your book, giving us glimpses into your really beautiful books. So all of these books appeared in the series, which has a long history and an ongoing commitment to publishing ethnographies that strive to redefine public debates on issues that matter to society at large. A series that publish books by anthropologists who are engaged intellectuals, as you are, and who care about what you are writing in ways that exceed making scholarly arguments, as important as those are, but to trying to open up dialogue with various communities and publics. So I would like to ask each of you to maybe say a little more about what it means for you to do public anthropology, to approach what you've been studying, whether it is educational success or aid in dying or parenting and caregiving. What it means to approach these issues through public-facing scholarship that is woven through from these threads of very intense and very intimate episodes of lived experience. What does it mean for you to be engaged intellectuals, and why do you do it despite the challenges that this form of scholarship that is directed both at academic and at broader audiences, that this dual commitment presents? Whoever wants to go first.
I can jump in if that's all right. So I wanted to write something from the outset that people outside of academia could read, families and loved ones of those caring for the population that I write about. Now, the book grew out of my PhD dissertation. So obviously in revising the text, it was important to cull a lot of the theoretical scaffolding that's necessary for a dissertation and be clearer with some of the subject matter that maybe a lot of your colleagues take for granted and that you even maybe take for granted yourself. I think that helped me kind of understand some of the subject matter better, if that makes sense, by doing that. And so, I'm really happy that my book is a part of the series, because I feel like when your work is empirically grounded in the, people's lives and is about understanding such important subject matter, whether it be forms of oppression and violence or whatever, you kind of owe it to your participants for it to be accessible. So for me, and I say this in the introduction to the book, but the book I see it as a public form of personal care. it's an effort on my end to socialize the world, to meet children like Pearl and my son. And so for me, this is just one of many projects that I hope to be involved with throughout my life that take up this task. And so in my case, I'd say my role as a public anthropologist is quite central to my sense of self.
I can go next. Echoing kind of what Aaron said, in some ways, I think for me, working with these young people meant a commitment to them beyond the time of doing the research, and a commitment to remain in their lives as much as they wanted me to, but also to do right by them in the writing that I was doing around them. And that's manifested in ways of like having the young people read the things that I'm writing about them and see what they think about it. And it also means making sure that their voices are central and that they are making public anthropology and their critiques of the world, right? It's just kind of a vernacular anthropology without all the jargon that we learn in grad school, right? And so I think that to me, it was important to put that center, and public anthropology to me means making the sense that the people that we work with make of their worlds visible, and that that is a commitment. That is something that anthropology does well, right? Of showing how people live their lives. And when we make it too much about the things that we learn in the context of the academy, we kind of take away from what anthropology can be. And it can be showing like Aaron mentioned, showing how the world can be better for people like the people we're talking about and have the privilege to work with. And I think that is why anthropology matters as a field more broadly. So to me, I hope to continue that with my work, and part of writing is part of being a public anthropologist, but I also think it goes beyond that in terms of like I try to remain active in the young people's lives, but also in figuring out how do we make the things that they found out and I found out work for their experiences. So that's why I continue to do work with the program that I had the great fortune to get to be part of. And so making sure that we can not just make the stories visible, but how do we make the work better?
So a lot of what Aaron and Andrea said really resonates with me as well. I think for me, public anthropology is really about the writing side of it anyway, is about making sure that it's accessible. And so the exercise that I did, or kind of the imagined reader that I had in my head as I was writing this book, was really different from the one that I had in my head for previous books. And I think also career stage for me anyway matters here, because this wasn't my first book. And so I wasn't kind of thinking in terms of tenure and whatnot, but I was really thinking sort of about my mom as I was writing, someone who is educated and probably interested in this topic, but no background exposure to anthropology. And then I actually had my mother read the whole manuscript and just asked her to be ruthless in highlighting any words or concepts that didn't make sense to her. And I just got rid of all of them. So that was really helpful. And then I think the other piece of it is sort of thinking about the kind of impact that I want my book to have and my research to have. And the topic that that my book is about and that I've been working on is one that is covered a lot in the national media, and many, if not all, people have strong opinions about it. And what I saw my task as doing was to kind of unsettle some of those opinions. And I wanted to reframe some of the existing debates and conversations and kind of raise new questions. So I wanted people to be a little bit ambivalent and unsettled, where once they thought they knew how they felt about medical aid in dying. And I wanted to reveal some of the nuances and complexities that I think can often be erased from the public conversations. So for me, this was really about the anthropology side of public anthropology, because I think this is sort of showing how an anthropological perspective can really add something quite different to ongoing public conversations and really speaks to the value of public anthropology.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these insights. I'm sure they are very helpful to future authors who are aspiring to publish in public anthropology. So another question, maybe we have a little bit more time, I would like to hear from you about is that all of these three wonderful books that I just want to show, all of them were written and went into production before the COVID-19 pandemic. But the issues that each of you write about, approach in your books, education and immigration and belonging, assisted aid in dying, medical aid in dying, or as well as parenting, definitely, and caregiving, they have all been deeply affected by the pandemic and also by societal responses to it. So lockdowns and at-home schooling and so on and so forth. All of these issues have been thrown into sharper relief, perhaps. And I was wondering, as you look back at the research you've done for these books, how have these recent events maybe challenged you to rethink what you have learned, what you have observed? Or perhaps it is the other way around, what in your past work helped you be better prepared for what we've all been living through for the past year and a half, maybe informed your understanding so that it wasn't so shocking as it has been to many of us. If you have any comments on that.
I can jump in. I actually have a coda in my book that's about the pandemic. I was sort of finishing up final revisions in spring 2020 as COVID was beginning. And I remember having some conversations with people around me about whether this would be a good idea or not to add a few words about COVID, because, some folks thought that it was going to be over really quickly, and that was going to then date my book in funny ways to have this afterward about COVID. I now am very glad that I did it because it has proven that it was not as ephemeral as we might have thought at the time. And I think for me, it was just impossible to write about death without acknowledging what was happening at the time in March, April 2020. And so I think for me, what COVID really brought out is sort of a theme that was always there in my research, which is that medical aid in dying is a really incredibly privileged type of death that very few people will ever experience, very few people will ever want to experience. But even then, maybe if they do want it, they might not have access to it for various reasons. And then, of course, the point that we don't all get to plan what kind of death we have, because death can be sudden and traumatic and all that. And so I think that seeing these horrible deaths that were unfolding at the beginning of COVID really brought into relief just how privileged it is to choose assisted death. But I think also it highlighted another kind of background message of my work, which is that we really need to be having conversations about our mortality more often, and they started to happen then, and I think that's continued. And so I felt like the writing about death in this way was really valuable, even though in some ways the kinds of deaths that I was writing about were very, very different from COVID deaths.
So the pandemic certainly revealed certain things that that were clear to me from my research, that, like, for example, that older siblings in immigrant origin households are often managing the educations of their younger siblings. And we saw that being put in really stark relief for what happened with homeschooling in the pandemic. And so I think in the field of education, certainly we just saw that the inequalities that we kind of in the back of our mind knew were there were just put in the front of our minds. But when I think about how COVID makes me rethink my work, is I spend a lot of time in the book talking about little acts of care that matter, listening to each other as young people in this program, postering about the program, to just these like small things that we do to repair our social worlds. And I think we're seeing that those small acts matter when we see things about uproar about mask mandates, or at this whether or not to get vaccinated, right? That these little acts of care matter because they protect us all, right? And these young people were arguing for that care, right? When they do those things like listen to each other, or refuse to accept the fact that an undocumented student wasn't worthy of college, or that the only undocumented students that are the ones that are high achievers, right? So I think that is really where I see kind of the COVID intervention here, and thinking about my work, is that we're seeing now how much care truly matters. And I would just say that the other thing that COVID kind of impacts my work is my book is dedicated to my grandmother, who died not of COVID, but she died actually a year ago today. And as she was dying, it was difficult to go into the hospital. And she was able to come home, and we all kind of threw away our masks and were just there with her. As Mara, your things were reminding me of, that she did have a good death, and that death was because she was being cared for. And I think that gave a lot of comfort as I think about this, what I think is the kind of way, like I said, the way that we make sense of our social worlds is through care. And I think we're seeing that now in the way that certain rituals have been disrupted.
We're coming out of a really extended lockdown here in Melbourne. It's not actually something I've thought about a great deal, but two things that do come to mind are that, I think with being in lockdown with COVID, has it been productive for parents in connecting to online communities and sharing their stories with others, so continuing on with these public forms of personal care online, which a lot of them are already doing. The other thing is, I guess, I really focus on embodied communication in the book, and being in lockdown, I wonder what kinds of, I see that as being so important in widening our circles of care, and I wonder if the lockdown, has sort of exacerbated caregivers' loneliness and sense of isolation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. Once again, if you are watching this and don't have your copy of these amazing books, there is a discount code in the chat. Go ahead and use it. I'm really grateful for your time and for sharing with us your insights about public anthropology and your really stellar scholarship. And I think that's it, unless Kate, you have some final words.
No, I just want to say that it's been an honor to publish all three of you, and I'm just really proud of these books. And to me, they do embody what we look for when we talk about public anthropology, right? Which is books that have an impact beyond the field. And the one thing I was going to add is that I always think of not only just accessibility of writing, but the sort of politics that drive the book are important and articulated. And I just feel that acutely in all of these projects. So I do hope everyone reads them and takes advantage of the discount, and that it won't be long before we're together in person, sort of celebrating the series and these wonderful achievements. So thank you.
All right, thank you all. This is my cat Giacometti. He clearly thinks this this event is time's up. Yes, I really hope to see you in person soon. Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.